Good morning and welcome to the Avenue Uniting Church in Blackburn, Victoria on a beautiful, sunny and very peaceful Sunday morning. My name is Rod Peppiatt and I'm the minister of this congregation, and each Sunday and at some other times in between we meet on the lands of the Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nation. Today my reflection is based on the fact that tomorrow is the 11th of November. And on the 11th of November, at the 11th hour of the 11th month, we pause in what is known as Remembrance Day, the anniversary of the day in 1918 when the guns fell silent in World War I. My title, if you like, is "Not as the world gives, do I give you peace." And that comes from John's Gospel, chapter 14, from part of the very long reading in there of Jesus' Last Supper with his friends, and particularly in verse 27 of chapter 14, where he says these words: "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Let not your hearts be troubled, and do not let them be afraid." And then the second reading I want to bring is also from John's Gospel, a little bit later in the Gospel, and the action has moved from the Last Supper to Jesus' trial before Pilate. And I'm reading from chapter 18, verse 33. "Then Pilate entered the headquarters again, summoned Jesus and asked him, 'Are you king of the Jews?' Jesus answered, 'Do you ask this on your own, or did others tell you about me?' Pilate replied, 'I'm not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priests have handed you over to me. What have you done?' Jesus answered, 'My kingdom does not belong to this world. If my kingdom belonged to this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here.' Pilate asked, 'So you are a king?' Jesus answered, 'You say that I'm a king. For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice.' Pilate asked him, 'What is truth?' Not as the world gives, do I give you peace." I've had those words rattling around in my head for a while now as I thought about today's worship, which will be here in just a little while. I'm actually recording in advance today. Not as the world gives, do I give you peace. And alongside that second passage that I read from John's Gospel, where Jesus is on trial for his life, they have shaped how I've been thinking about peace today, as have all kinds of events in the world around us, including this week, the election of Donald Trump in the US, and all of the other stories of, if you like, peacelessness that we see in the world. But back to Jesus and Pilate. You might remember the interrogation there and Jesus' response to Pilate's question about whether he's a king of the Jews, where he says those words, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over." I grew up hearing that Pilate was being told by Jesus that his kingdom was in another place, removed from this world. Now that may be true, but I think he was also saying that his kingdom, his way, was different in nature as well. Nature and style and its being. I believe he was saying that Pilate was not going to understand him because the only peace that Pilate understood was Pax Romana, the Roman peace, best expressed like Well, you do things our way and there'll be peace. Otherwise, we'll come down on you like a ton of bricks. Not as the world gives, do I give you peace. These words sit with me as I think about responses, my response to days like tomorrow, Remembrance Day. Once upon a time, they inspired me to think that I wanted nothing to do with days like Anzac and Remembrance Day. I found it really easy to hold myself distant from what I saw of the militarism of these days. And then I entered a small country town as its minister, and I began to discover my own arrogance. As I learned to love the people of Borough and the district around it, I learned to love their stories too, and to see in those good people gathering for the Remembrance Day services a different sense of peace. I learned to suspend judgment and to listen for what they were remembering. And I will always be glad that I had the wisdom and the patience to grow through that listening. I still sit somewhat uncomfortably with days like Remembrance, and particularly with Anzac Day. And Anzac Day, I believe in particular, has become something quite different from what it was created to be. It's become something of a jingoistic exercise in, I'm not quite sure what, to be honest. And I sit uncomfortably with my role as a Christian minister in the midst of it all, particularly when I see the way of Christ appropriated by the way of empire, the sort of God is on our side idea. And I sit uncomfortably because I'm challenged by the words of Jesus. Not as the world gives, do I give you peace. If I believe, as I do, that my calling is to be a peacemaker in the name and the way of Jesus, then the nature of that peace seems to be quite different from the way in which we understand the word. It's much more than simply the absence of fighting. It's different from the idea of my army is bigger than your army and so I'm going to keep the peace by force, and all of the other rhetoric we hear around the world so constantly. It seems to me that we're hearing more sabre rattling and global trash talk at now than I can remember for a long time. Not only political, but religious as well, as much as anything else by people identifying as Christian. And I struggle to reconcile that with the way of Jesus. Now, many of you have lived through wars, and so I'm not proceeding to tell you how to understand that experience. But what I'm saying is, for me, I'm hearing more, I think, than I can remember hearing in a long time of that kind of peace talk. To his disciples and to Pilate, Jesus said something like this: my peace isn't like a Pax Romana. It's not simply the absence of fighting. My peace is like shalom, the word that comes from Hebrew, translating as something way beyond simply absence of fighting. It means being in a state of wholeness and harmony and completeness and prosperity and welfare and tranquility. And for me, that doesn't sit well beside the kind of peace the world gives, particularly as I think what's happening in Israel and Gaza and Lebanon and all of that sort of area now. And yet it has to, somehow. I have to be willing to wrestle with these things in my head and my heart. Because if I know anything about Jesus, it's that he lived in the real world and he wrestled with it too. His world was dominated by empire as ours is today. He had in his face, literally, the signs of empire in the in the soldiers and the short swords and all of that sort of stuff. He challenged it by speaking truth to power, but he never tried to pretend it wasn't there. He challenged the way things are by refusing to accept that that's how they had to stay, but also by acting with grace towards people on the outer. He challenged it by inviting people to imagine another way of seeing and of naming that reality. He challenged it by blessing the people that others called cursed. And he did it in the name of God, because he refused to believe that God wasn't in the midst of all of that life, as messy and violent as it was, calling people to hope instead of despair, to love instead of to fear, calling people to a common humanity out of tribalism and hatred. It can be hard to practice peace, can't it? To dream it, to imagine it, to live it, rather than being overwhelmed by all that works against it. And it was hard for Jesus too. It got him killed. And yet enough people believed in the truth of his teaching and his example to remember it and preserve it as a gift for all time. What we call the Beatitudes, we could also call Jesus' picture and vision for peace. As I mentioned, I struggle with what Anzac Day has become in recent years. I'm not ignoring the need for military and defence forces. That's a reality of the world. Nor am I in any of this disparaging in any way the people who fought to serve their countries. Both my grandfathers did so, and I honour that deeply. I grieve, as I suspect they did, a world where that proves necessary. For me, Anzac Day has become difficult, but Remembrance Day is somehow different. It's a deliberate attempt to celebrate the days the guns fell silent. I sincerely believe that it offers an invitation to reflect and remember with dignity and with honesty the hopes that it carried in 1918 and still carry. It speaks the truth of the good people who have come back from the calamity of so many wars and somehow put their lives back together. If we listen, it might also help us hear the truth of the ex-service women and men who take their own lives at a rate 5 times that of the general population. If we listen honestly, we might also recognise the stories of the Indigenous people who've served Australia in war, whose stories have rarely been told, including the 50 who were left in South Africa at the end of the Boer War, denied re-entry into Australia under the White Australia policy. At the same time, if we listen honestly, we also hear the truth of the young service women and men that we see so often in disasters here and abroad, often offering humanitarian aid in our name. I have hope for Remembrance Day because it calls us to listen, to remember our shared stories as Australians, and because it calls us to peace. And I believe that the Spirit of God is in that, despite everything. Not as the world gives, do I give you peace. Thanks be to God. Blessings.